Yes, I am. Thanks very much. You'll notice that I felt rather like someone who turns up to a fantasy dress party in a business suit, so I've adjusted my background to make sure I'm compliant with what everybody else is doing. So
That's good on you.
Let me share my screen. So I'm going to spend a little time talking about the Mojaloop API family. If I'd been talking a couple of convenings ago, I would probably have just said the Mojaloop API. But you will see as I go through the presentation why it is that we now started to talk about an API family. And in celebration of the family, I thought that it would be useful to have a short quote from Ovid, who, as I'm sure most of you will know, is renowned for his abilities to talk about best practice in API design. However, moving right along. So the Mojaloop API was originally developed to support interoperability for funds transfers between deposit holding DFSPs, i.e. banks, mobile money systems, those sorts of institutions. It was first used actually in a peer-to-peer implementation between mobile money technology providers, and subsequently used as the basis for the switch-based implementation that Miguel has been explaining to you with such aplomb. The characteristics of the API are as follows. So we use something that's not exactly a REST architecture, but a service-oriented REST architecture. That's what we're calling it. So differences from what you would call a classic REST architecture are as follows. First of all, the services are distributed. There's no central authority which executes a transfer. A transfer is executed as an orchestration between the participants, who are normally two in the instances we've been looking at, but maybe more than two. So, for instance, if a transaction is initiated by somebody else, a third-party initiator, for instance, then there will be three parties to the transfer. But there are always at least two, and the switch itself. So the transfer is orchestrated between those, and at certain points in the transfer, one or other of those participants will have control, i.e. the ability to say, should the transfer go ahead or not. Second, services imply actions as well as defining content. And that is, when someone sends a message, that typically doesn't just mean here is a document of a particular kind, you decide what to do about it. It means do something. So that again is a subtle but important change, I suppose, from the classic REST architecture. Also, the services in the Mojaloop API are not fully stateless. Some parts of the orchestration of a transfer rely on the ability of a party to compare a state with a previous state. And you'll see some instances, some examples of how that happens a bit later on. The final difference is that it's the clients who decide the common reference IDs, whereas in the standard REST architecture, it would be the central server who decides on the reference ID. So, the API uses HTTP. It uses transport layer security and standard HTTP calls, gets, puts, posts, those sorts of things. It's a matter of fundamental importance, we think, for the openness and for the cost reduction, the cheapness of operation of a system like this, that it should not require the use of very sophisticated VPNs or anything like that to implement. It's implemented over the public internet and secured with TLS, transport layer security. We use JSON as the data exchange format. largely because it's relatively light on data. It's a much more concise notation than, for instance, XML would be. And as Miguel has already said, but I will emphasize again, all the services are asynchronous. So what happens is if a party sends a message to the switch will respond almost immediately. So it will do some very basic checking that the request is well formed, those sorts of things. And it will then send something back immediately saying, yes, I got my message. And it will typically distinguish between saying, yes, I've got the message and I will get back to you, or yes, I've got the message and you can forget about it. There's nothing more coming back. So if there is an error immediately identified, then it will come back in that return. But in all other cases, errors are sent back asynchronously in the same way as success responses are. So the switch or the participant will generate a new message saying there is an error and this is what it is. And this works in the following way. So the responder will answer to the originating resource as it normally would, but to a slightly different endpoint. As you can see there, the normal response is a put to the quotes resource with an identifier associated with it. The error response is also a put to the quotes resource, but to the error endpoint, which you can see at the end of that call. And it sends a standard message body, which is the same for all error types. It contains the error code and the description of the error, and there is space inside it to add additional information if this is required. But generally speaking, the model is it should simply include the error code and a description of the error. And those of you who take a look at the API specification will see that it contains a list of the allowable error codes and the meaning of each error code. So that's how we do error processing using the API. Here's a brief schematic of what it looks like. The client sends a request. The server sends back a 202, which says, I've got the request, it was well formed, I'll get back to you. If a processing error occurs, the server will then send back a response that says, here is the answer and it's an error. And the client will then respond with a 200 because nothing else is required, saying, yep, I got the message and I understand it. Okay. So the level playing field that we've talked about quite a lot is about enabling very different kinds of actors to behave in a standard way. So we started thinking that we would have a single API, that every participant in a scheme would support the standard API, and all of them would support all of it. So there is a change control board in the Mojaloop Foundation, which was a single body which was charged with maintaining the API, with approving changes to it, its definition, and so on and so forth. However, as the well-known poet Matthew Arnold said, there is always a set of new things turning up. And the same is true in this case. We have a number of new roles that we are going to need to think about. First of all, payment initiation service providers, the third parties like Google Pay, who initiate transfers without being themselves account holders. We also think in terms of cross-network providers, i.e. people who provide a service which interoperates between Mojaloop networks or between Mojaloop networks and non-Mojaloop networks. Aggregators, who are people who provide higher level services than the simple P2P transfers that the payment initiation service providers provide. but also without being account holders themselves in the system. Foreign exchange providers, where we imagine Mojaloop schemes. Well, we don't have to imagine it because we have examples of Mojaloop schemes that cross jurisdictions and therefore need to provide foreign exchange services for conversion of funds as transfers are made. Account payees, people, utilities, for instance, where people will need to find out whether a particular account has been, whether a particular payment has been credited to their account at a utility, those sorts of things. So lots of different roles. And the question that we had to answer was, how are we going to allow all these new roles? What are we going to do? So we also didn't want to constrain a participant to only one type of role. We wanted to be able to say, for instance, that someone who wanted to be a cross-network provider could also be a foreign exchange provider. Someone who wanted to be an ordinary DFSP perhaps could be a cross-network provider, or indeed a foreign exchange provider. We wanted some way of allowing participants to discover which other participants in the scheme could fulfill a particular role. So some way to ask the question, who are the cross-network providers in this scheme? Who are the foreign exchange providers? Who are the third parties? Those sorts of things. Now, standard actions might be different also in different role situations. And we wanted to have some good way of expressing that. So let me take an example. Let's suppose that I am someone who runs a payroll system. I want to be able to send a payroll to the switch, and I want that payroll to be processed so that all of the recipients get it. Now I don't want to have an account myself if I can avoid it. So I don't want to wind up in a situation where the employer sends the pay amount to me and then I parcel it up. What I would like to be able to do is something like what a third-party provider does, i.e. just say to the switch, please arrange to have this amount of money transferred from the payroll owner to these recipients. So that's kind of like an ordinary funds transfer, but it's more complicated than that. There are a lot more things that I'm going to need to include, which I wouldn't need to include if I were simply doing a P2P transfer, person-to-person transfer. So we need to have some good way of saying, this is a request to pay, we might call it, but it's a request to pay which is specific to aggregators. Equally, we didn't want participants to be able to access a particular endpoint if their role doesn't support access to it. So, for instance, if we think of third-party initiators, people like Google Pay, there are lots of things that they won't be allowed to do because they don't have accounts. They won't be allowed to respond to quotations. They won't be allowed to send quotations directly. All of the things that you have to have an account in order to do, or which you have to participate in settlement in order to do, they shouldn't be allowed to do. So we had to do something which enabled us to allow lots of different types of participant in a scheme, but also met the constraints that you see on this slide. So our solution was to allow multiple APIs in the system. In fact, to encourage multiple APIs in the system. We thought that there would be an API definition specific to a particular set of role interactions. Now, that may include more than one role type. In fact, in most cases, it will include more than one role type. Let's look at the example again of the payment initiation service provider, the third-party provider, the Google Pay. We need two roles there. First of all, the Google Pay itself, which is the payment initiation service provider, but also we wanted an ordinary account holding participant to be able to decide whether or not they wanted to support access for third-party providers. Now, this is because you might easily suppose that a bank or a mobile money system which had an awful lot of accounts would be interested in providing that functionality. A very small entity, like, for instance, a microfinance initiative, though it did hold accounts, would probably not be interested in incurring the overhead of supporting that additional form of access. And we wanted to provide the flexibility to allow people to, pardon me, to decide whether or not they were going to respond. So participants then will be registered for certain roles, and we wanted to allow a participant to have more than one role type. And the API for a given set of role interactions will only specify the messages which constitute a role type. Sorry, a role interaction. So for instance, the interactions that are to do with initiating payments via a third party, or initiating cross-network transfers, or initiating currency conversion transfers and managing them. So that sounds reasonably okay. But then what about situations where more than one API uses the same message or the same data object, which are likely to occur quite regularly, particularly, as I've said, in cases where we're going to have similar messages, but slightly different depending on the particular scenario we're talking about. What about situations where it's not clear whether a new API is required or not? How do we keep the various APIs aligned with each other? And how do we make sure that everybody is following the best practice, or at least the standard practice in Mojaloop, which of course is the best practice? So we also, it's interesting, same slide, pardon me. Oh, we've got lots of slides. Oh no, we haven't, sorry, I understand what's happening now. So, where more than one API uses the same message, we would store the object centrally, and the APIs can simply include it in their definitions. The API definitions are standard Swagger definitions, Open API 3 definitions. So, of course, they can include definitions from elsewhere, and that's how we would plan to use the same data object in different APIs. Where it's not clear whether a new API is required or not, we would have a standard way of deciding on that. And that is to really change the construction and the way in which the change control board is organized. So individual APIs in the future are going to be managed by special interest groups. So for instance, the existing API, the existing open API that governs standard transfers and the activities around them will now be managed by a special interest group. And the new PISP interface will have its own special interest group, which in the first instance will be composed largely of people who are working on the development of that interface. And our idea is that each special interest group will have a representative on a new change control board. The new change control board will have a representative from each special interest group, as we've said. It will be responsible for defining the best practice in definition and documentation, and for ensuring that the definitions produced by the special interest groups comply with that definition. It's also going to be the guardian of the common data objects, and it's going to be responsible for changing them as required. And it's going to be responsible for reviewing proposed APIs and for the publishing process to take them through to production. And it has an overall responsibility for harmony and world peace, because it's possible to imagine a situation where a number of different work streams are going on, each of which may have its own API. And we need to make sure that all of those are producing something which is fitting in with an overall picture of what the Mojaloop switch is like and what it does. So what we want the new world to look like is something like the following. We want to be clear to a new observer what sorts of roles Mojaloop supports, that people can understand how those roles relate to each other. For instance, in the case of DFSP, who is both an ordinary DFSP and a DFSP that provides services to third-party initiators, people need to be able to understand what the differences are between those two roles, what the additional responsibilities are that are reflected in the fact that a DFSP supports third-party initiators. They will need to be able to understand how individual APIs support participants and what the standard operational patterns for Mojaloop's APIs are, i.e., everything will need to work in a way that's roughly similar so that people can understand. Once they understand one way of interacting, it will be relatively easy for them to understand other ways of interacting. Now, as far as the teams go, teams will need to understand clearly whether or not their work requires a new API, how to define the roles associated with their work, how to go about defining an API to support those roles, i.e. what best practices in this area, and how their API relates to the overall landscape of Mojaloop. So we find ourselves on the very moment at which the change control board is changing from its original form to this new form that I've just described and outlined here. We would be very thankful, grateful for any contributions in this area, for anyone who has suggestions as to how we might work, anyone who has proposals. If you do, please let me know and I will be happy to respond to you and to incorporate them. But for the moment, I only have to ask whether you have any questions, and of course to say, if you do have any questions, the discourse page is the place to go. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks so much, Michael. We are a few minutes ahead of time. So excellent job making up some time, Michael. I do want to promote, I do want to just share a link to discourse. There was a proposal for feedback on restructuring the change control board. I just posted that link in the chat, just in case you want to go into the details of what Michael was talking about a bit, and we'll reflect on it as well tomorrow. Excellent. This roundly brings us back to the break. I will be generous and I will give you a 15 minutes break